If you have a smart speaker, you have access to the entire world of NPR and St. Louis Public Radio. All the latest news and all the captivating stories. Activate our voices with yours by telling your smart speaker to play St. Louis Public Radio.
Steve Roberts emerged out of a crowded Democratic primary to represent a state house district in central and north St. Louis. And he has some ideas about what he'll face when he enters the Missouri General Assembly. The Democrat joins us next on another edition of Politically Speaking.
9, 8, 7,
6, 5, 4,
3, 2, 1.
I think that is fair
As
to
I
say.
say, hands to kiss and babies to shake. But
I think my record speaks for itself.
That's a really good question.
Hello and welcome to the Politically Speaking podcast. I'm your host, Jason Rosenbaum, a reporter with St. Louis Public Radio. Jo Mannies is still on vacation, so filling in for her, we have
Liz Schlemmer, and I'm the news intern here at St. Louis Public Radio.
We appreciate your time. And joining us as our special guest, the winner of the 77th District Democratic House primary, we have in studio.
Steve Roberts, State Representative-elect for the 77th District.
Now, this is an important question. Do we refer to you as just Steve Roberts Jr., Steve Roberts II, Steve Roberts the Amazing, or something like that?
Is it representative now or the honorable?
You have to win your unopposed general election first. But
I'm getting ahead of myself.
Yeah.
Steve's fine.
Yeah. You just won a 4-person Democratic primary where, again, the election there is tantamount to election. We'll get to that in a minute. But before we get to that, tell us a little bit about yourself, about your political family, because you do come from a political family, and anything else we want to know about Steve Roberts Jr. Second.
Sure. I'll give you my little 30-second bio. Well, I was born and raised here in the city of St. Louis, fourth generation St. Louisan. I went to law school. I'm an attorney by training on the West Coast. I went to Pepperdine, and it was really there that I developed a real passion for criminal justice. I was able to work there with the Compton District Attorney's Office as a certified law clerk. And then from that experience, I was selected to work with an organization called the Council to Secure Justice in New Delhi, India. And then through that experience, I was selected to work with one of my professors. He had a clinic in Los Angeles, California, where we were helping refugees fleeing persecution, get asylum here in the U.S. So that kind of was my start and interest in public service.
And after you graduated from law school, looking at your bio, I think you first went to work in the private sector and then you worked in the circuit attorney's office.
That's right. Yeah, I was working in-house with a private equity company in San Diego, California. They hired me right out of law school. And I was there just over a year when the events in Ferguson happened, and that really kind of rekindled my interest in criminal justice. So I quit my job, had my salary more than cut in half to work here in the city as a prosecutor.
How was that experience? Because I've heard Jennifer Joyce say some not so good things about you, which I want to give you the opportunity to say anything if you want to.
Sure. I mean, for me, it was interesting. I mean, I was like the first, I think, African-American male hired by that office in the last 16 years. And it was in offices that, for the most part, we prosecute young black men like myself. And that was kind of one of the other things I didn't like about it is catching young men really on the back end, at least by the way the laws are currently structured and under the current leadership of the office to really make an impact in their lives. So that's kind of what drew me to the legislature.
You had almost were thinking of running for the circuit attorney's office. You're only like 26, 27 years old. Is that correct?
28, that's right.
28. So when you first told me about that, I know that there's been youngish circuit attorneys before, but I was like, are you really sure about that? And what made you change from circuit attorney to state rep? Obviously, one of the factors was Kim Gardner decided to run for circuit attorney, but
right.
You were thinking of running for that job. What made you change your mind, essentially?
Well, for me, I think that to make the real changes I wanted to through policy and criminal justice reform, which is something I've always been passionate about, that can only be done in the legislature.
And now that the election's over, we didn't really cover your campaign very closely, and I was wondering, now that you've succeeded, how do you think it went? What was it like campaigning?
Oh, it was great. I mean, of course, it's I'm sure if you ask any candidate, it's very stressful, but I had a great team, a good support system with my family. We were all working hard, and it
Your dad was actually Steve Roberts Sr., who used to be an alderman, is now part of the Roberts brothers development team.
That's right.
How did growing up seeing how he operated influence you to get into politics?
Well, when he was in politics, I was very, very young. I mean, he also ran for mayor, I think I was probably like 6 or 7 years old. So
You probably don't remember that much of it.
yeah.
Yeah, but how did he? I'm sure he's told you stories. I'm sure you've talked to your uncle who also was in politics too. Like, how did that affect your thinking going forward?
Well, for me, I mean, public service was always really important to me and my family. So I think that kind of rubbed off on me.
And how do you think your background as a prosecutor will affect what issues are important to you or what approach you'll take in the legislature?
Well, the one thing I liked about being a prosecutor is that it kind of was a glimpse behind the curtain. You know, you could really see, from the prosecutor's perspective, and as far as that as well, like, different charging decisions, things like that. So as far as, at least for me, a certain level of empathy. Like I said, I'm really interested in criminal justice reform, so I think that kind of helps me there.
Well, let's kind of dive right into that subject because you're kind of going to be going into a legislature where quote-unquote criminal justice reform, or as I like to call it, maybe the post-Ferguson, post-Michael Brown policy agenda, hasn't really gotten a lot of traction. You've had things like Senate Bill 5 pass, which didn't really affect the city of St. Louis that much because the percentage of revenue is not that high. But that has been castigated by some as not being a very effective response to Ferguson. What would you want to do in the legislature to deal with that issue more specifically?
One thing I'd like to focus on more specifically is path to expungement, especially for low-level drug offenses. I mean, I can't tell you how many defendants I interviewed who, as I'm sure you both are well aware, once you're a convicted felon, you can be legally discriminated against in your housing, your employment, sometimes losing the right to vote, at least until you're off papers. And a lot of these guys I spoke with just kind of felt like, I mean, it's universal that young people do stupid things, but it's really kind of unique to our culture where that can really follow them for the rest of their lives.
Do you think that criminal justice reform can achieve bipartisan support?
I do.
Well, explain why, yeah.
Well, I think that in the benefit it works, because I think we've tried this kind of mass incarceration model and that doesn't work. It's, the definition of insanity is trying the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. So I think that when you can show data and to people that, the real way to fix this is we need a different path.
Do you think that there are areas of reform that are more palatable to conservatives, or are there specific things that you want to focus on in that reform?
Certain low-level drug offenses like marijuana possession, things like that would be more palliative.
What do you think of the idea of bringing in a outside prosecutor, an outside investigator whenever there's a police-involved killing? Because that was a big issue during the circuit attorney's race. It's an issue that actually has gotten some bipartisan support in the legislature. But frankly, some prosecutors like Jennifer Joyce and Bob McCullough, and even some former prosecutors like Claire McCaskill, don't really particularly care for that idea. What would be your mindset if that comes down the pike?
I definitely recognize, and I think that, having worked closely with police officers, when you're in the warrant office, we see them every day. And I think at the very least, there's a view in the public, justifiably can say that, look, we see a conflict here. So I think that it makes sense that we consider, having an outside prosecutor, or maybe it be handled by like the Attorney General's office.
The one thing that opponents of that have said, that if you have an Attorney General who campaigned for office and was really, really quote unquote pro-police, like let's say Bob McCullough became Attorney General or Josh Hawley became Attorney General, that's not going to be as effective as of a outside or independent situation. How would you respond to that type of argumentation?
Well, I think it is because you're having a set of attorneys who don't necessarily, another example or something I could do would you have a different county prosecutor and come in. So, wherever you have lawyers who aren't the same ones interacting with the police that they're going to be calling as witnesses within the city.
So you received endorsements from the AFL-CIO and you've received other labor support, and was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about your stance on right to work.
Sure. I'm very pro-union. I think, right to work less. So definitely opposing it.
Tell me why you think that's not a good idea.
Well, I think that it's an opportunity for, cutting off their funding in such a way, you're in a sense, cutting them off at the knees, so they won't be able to, press for the things that are important to us.
Yeah, because for our listeners, right to work is kind of shorthand for a policy that would bar unionized companies or entities from forcing workers to pay dues if the majority has voted to organize. So, you can actually decide not to be in a union, but in that situation in Missouri, you would still have to pay dues.
Right.
So this is really about a union's ability to still be financially viable
Exactly.
in that situation. I mean, I think the reason Liz asked that question is, depending on who's governor, that could become the top issue once you enter the legislature. What's kind of your expectations about how, all-consuming that's going to become in 2017?
I'm not sure. It really depends on the objectives that are and what's before us.
Yeah, and I guess it also depends on who the governor is. So if Eric Greitens becomes governor, they may just try to push it really quickly, and it might pass regardless of whether you're opposed to it or not.
Right.
And if Chris Koster is governor, there's a mighty high veto override hill to climb over.
Well, and also going into a legislature as a Democrat where you'll be in the super minority, we're also wondering, how are you going to make some of these arguments to Republicans, especially with right to work, to Republicans who would say that it's boosted economies in other states that have adopted similar laws?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think what we need to do I think it's important to always be willing to reach across the aisle. I mean, for example, I was recently selected to participate in the Missouri Chamber of Commerce's Leadership Missouri class of 2016, and that's a group that typically, at least fiscally, is on the conservative bend. So I think that being able to just try to find common ground and meet with people and focus on the issues that we agree on.
I mean, that's going to be a question we ask to any freshman state Democratic rep. We had Peter Meredith on the show, and his campaign situation was that he was pretty liberal to progressive on a lot of issues, as I'm sure you are as well. But he was also talking extensively about how he was going to work with Republicans on issues that they can find common ground on. I've noticed there's a lot of people that are kind of coming in to the St. Louis city delegation that may be taking that similar mindset. Would that be kind of your mindset going into, or are you playing to be like a rabble-rouser who fights, so to speak?
It'll be my first time serving in the legislature. Haven't really thought about that.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like a question that I guess you got to answer once you get there before you decide.
On your website, you talked about education policy in terms of access to college, and I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that, and then also talk a little bit more about K through 12 policy.
I think that's a great question. I mean, we've got a big problem in this city of not being able to pay our teachers competitive salaries, so a lot of times they'll move out to the county where they can make more money. So I think different paths to secure funding to them. And as far as to college, the importance of that, I mean, a big push for the STEM education fields. I think, for example, programs like Cortex, which is part of it's in my district, and securing funding for organizations like the Missouri Economic Development Programs would be a big step in that direction.
Now, the St. Louis public schools, I mean, have become partially accredited in the last couple of years. There's still a lot of issues that come with the public schools here in St. Louis City, but there is some glimmers of hope, either with rising test scores, with the emergence of charter schools or gifted program. What other things would you want to do as a legislature to kind of keep that momentum going and make sure that it doesn't backslide back into unaccredited status?
Well, for me, a big thing, as I was saying earlier, is just to focus on the STEM education fields and making sure we get funding for those programs.
Can you tell us a little bit more about your plans for expanding access to college?
I think we need more pre-K program, just more of to get more funding for students to help cover their tuitions, things like that.
How would you do that in a limited resource environment that is Jefferson City of Missouri?
Just try to get through different policy measures that will allocate more funding to our students and public institutions.
Talk a little bit more about Medicaid expansion. I think that was something else that you've noted, is access to health care being an important thing that you want more citizens to have.
Absolutely. I mean, Missourians are taxed approximately $2 billion every year by the federal government, and that's money sent back to our General Assembly. But because we haven't expanded Medicaid, I mean, that checks pretty much left uncashed in the mailbox year after year. I mean, I think it's over like a $4 billion spread that's estimated to produce over 40,000 jobs in the state of Missouri alone. So I think that Medicaid expansion is very important.
Do you think that that's something that will be on the table? And, do you think that has the potential for having enough bipartisan support to go through this next session?
I do. I think that because it's, at the very least, it's in everyone's self-interest.
It seems like this is an ideological issue because we've had situations and we've had Democrats who make the same arguments as you, but the Republican legislature doesn't seem to listen very much. Is this a situation that you're going to need closer numbers in the House and the Senate in order to get momentum, or do you think you can actually get momentum if the Democrats are still in a superminority?
I think we could still get momentum with the Democrats still in the superminority.
How?
I think we just, like we're saying, we keep making those arguments, showing the research, the data, and just calmly try to persuade, look, we've tried this, here's the problems, here's the pitfalls from not incorporating these changes, here's why it's in your benefit. It doesn't just benefit St. Louis and Kansas City, but rural Missouri as well.
In addition to those issues, do you have any goals or very specific things that you would like to be able to work on while in Jeff City?
Criminal justice reform.
I'm not sure how many of the new people besides Peter Meredith are going to be attorneys. How do you think that expertise is going to help you overall in the legislature of being an attorney?
Well, I think it definitely helps as far as, drafting laws and certain ones, especially, how I think as a lawyer we're able to look at how poorly written laws can be interpreted in a negative way, like the recent constitutional carry and these this movement for the new stand your ground laws, where pretty much it's changes it from an objective to a subjective viewpoint of as far as fear and using lethal force. So I think that the lawyers, especially the ones from the St. Louis, are going to say, look, I know what you're trying to do here, but here's why this is a terrible idea, and try to find a more appropriate solution.
So I imagine that bill that you mentioned, which is going to be up for a veto override, that's
right.
not something you're terribly supportive of. Is that a fair assessment?
Fair. Yeah.
Can you explain why?
Yeah, I mean, I think that gets so much proof because you're trying to create something that might work in a rural Missouri, but in cities like Kansas City and St. Louis, where you've got a real problem of gun violence, that it's very dangerous.
Yeah, it doesn't seem, though, that Attorney General Koster, who's your Democratic gubernatorial nominee, is very receptive to these types of arguments. He's often touted the fact that he's been endorsed by the NRA in the past and has often talked up his pro-gun stances. Is that going to be a pretty big obstacle to overcome when you're in the legislature, if either he or Greitens are governor and they aren't very receptive to restricting firearms?
I mean, I can't speak for what they're going to do. So I don't know.
You're not going to have, as I mentioned on the outset, you don't have a Republican opponent. You're kind of going to be in a situation where you're going to be elected almost by default. So what are you going to be doing over the next few months as far as any election-related things or any getting up to speed on legislative things?
Yeah, I mean, a big thing I want to is help my friends who do have opponents in the general.
Like who?
I'd like to help on Koster's campaign. Cora Walker's a friend of mine. She's got an opponent in the general as well. And Bill Otto with his campaign, Jason Kander.
Yeah, Bill Otto, who's running for Congress, Jason Kander, who's running for the U.S. Senate.
Are there other questions that you wish that we would ask you or that you had been considering before walking into the studio today?
No.
You're not that inquisitive. I guess you're not as inquisitive as we thought. I'm joking on that. So we talked a little bit about this when we interviewed Peter Meredith. Like, there are kind of archetypes of people who go into the legislature. There's young guys or young women like yourself. There's kind of older, more established professionals. There's people who are retired. Have you talked with some of the newer people that have been kind of elected in a similar way that you have? And what are their expectations going in? Are they similar based off their life experience, basically?
Wow. Not really. I mean, I don't know. I can't say the few legislatures I do know. I mean, we all come from different backgrounds. At least for me, getting involved, I mean, I had certain advantages that a lot of people don't. I mean, I'm single. my parents have their health. I don't have any kids, so I know that for some legislatures that
that's a big barrier.
Yeah,
like when we were
that's what
talking
I'm
with
trying to say, big
when we were
barrier.
talking with Peter Meredith, who happened to have his daughter with him at the time. He mentioned the fact that there aren't many people who are, say, in their mid-30s who have kids, who have established professions, who can really give all of that up to go to the legislature.
Right.
And I think that there's a debate over whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. About in this term-limited environment, you have a lot of younger legislators kind of coming in with a burst of energy and enthusiasm. What do you kind of think about that as a reality for the legislature? Do you think that's a good thing that a younger person like you is going to be going into the legislature?
Yeah, I think we definitely need more young people involved in the legislature. I guess young, ambitious, and maybe a little naive.
A little naive?
Yeah.
So are you ready to have your naivete destroyed when you go to Jefferson City?
I don't know about that. I mean, I try to be a pretty optimistic person, so.
Well, we'll have to have you back on when you're actually legislating and not just talking about goals. So we appreciate your time this afternoon. For all of us, our stories, stlpublicradio.org. Follow me on Twitter at @Rosenbaum. Follow Liz on Twitter at
Liz_Schlemmer.
How do you spell your last name for listeners?
SCHLEMMER.
How would they follow you on Twitter?
Sure. Well, first, thanks again for having me, and you can follow me at robertsforstl.com.
Follow him. And
Roberts for STL is my handle. I'm not very good at Twitter.
Oh, that's okay. I'm sure you'll get better at Twitter as time goes on. Follow him on Twitter, and we'll be back next time. Until then, so long.
The Gateway brings you the day's news from the St. Louis region and across Missouri. It also includes stories from the Illinois side of the river and our Metro East reporter, Will Bauer.
In Alton, in Belleville, in East St. Louis, in Edwardsville, in Cahokia Heights, at Scott Air Force Base, I'm Will Bauer. St. Louis Public Radio.
Listen to reports from Will and all of our journalists weekdays on the Gateway, on the STLPR app, and wherever you get podcasts.